Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Level Up Podcast. I'm your host, Ken Rose, co-founder and CTO at OpsLevel. OpsLevel is an internal developer portal that helps engineering teams quickly ship quality software. Our Level Up Podcast explores challenges, best practices, and stories from some of the brightest engineering and DevOps leaders about what it takes to build great products, teams, and companies. Today, I'm excited to welcome Thomas Squeo, former CTO at Notified. Notified is a communications platform for public relations, investor relations, and virtual event experiences. Notified has hundreds of customers, just under 1,000 employees, and almost 100 developers, and about $200 million in revenue. Prior to Notified, Thomas was global CTO at Intrato. He has been a CIO. He's been involved in startups, and he just has a plethora of experience, both as an executive and as an engineer. So, Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Ken.
Yeah. So why don't we just start off? Tell us a little bit about that kind of journey around Intrato and also Notified.
Sure. I had the opportunity to be the leader of the technology organization at a company called School Messenger in 2015. They were recently acquired by West Corporation, which was a publicly held company that was operating in a holding company model. I joined the firm really to be part of the engineering organization, the product organization within that line of business. So as that acquisition started more of its integration, I moved to become the chief architect and head of transformation for all of West at the time, and that included how do you make a internal data center as attractive as the cloud? How do you bring cloud native behaviors to a what I'll call a cloud last kind of organization? It was more of a telco wholesaler at the time. So in that journey, we had to articulate a technology strategy that was really at the beginning pretty modest as far as how we're going to do the change. We were focused really on architecture principles, really getting an inventory of what was going into what was in the portfolio across those businesses. There were about 37 businesses. They were organized roughly around 5 segments at the time, and those reported up to like general managers that were responsible for all the aspects of those line of business. And in doing so, one of the things we laid out in our transformation agenda was really around this notion of how do we meet developers where they are and then bring them up in capacity. Late 2016, the organization went out, retained a banker. We moved from publicly traded to privately held. We went through, moved into private equity. Apollo Group bought the organization. And really what they took was that modest technology strategy and really kind of put a huge amount of priority and head of steam around it. So in early 2017, that acquisition was completed. We kind of looked at that technology strategy, how we would light it on fire and get it on, really get it moving much faster. And then in fall of that year, I became the chief technology officer and head of global cloud engineering for the organization. So in that, I was responsible for taking that technology strategy that was modest, putting all the requirements around business value capture with it, and then really going after it. We had new leadership, we had new executive leadership, we had a new remit from an investment thesis, and we had a new CIO who I reported to, who really supported kind of a broad brush transformation across the organization. And we were able to really take that on. We worked with everything from data center consolidation, network consolidation, what our overall process and process engineering, how we had actually work with our financial partners for how we organized and ultimately captured value of the work that we were doing. Some of that was in the form of service contract optimization. Some of that was in headcount reduction. But really what you had to do is while you were managing and transforming this business, you really had to focus on what were the cultures of those teams in order to be able to, bring them on that journey without having them all just kind of like throw their hands up and walk away.
Something I think a lot about is, I want to actually confirm something, right? West, it sounds like you came to West through an acquisition, and then West also had a bunch of acquisitions, right? You mentioned, I think, 37 different businesses, 5 different segments. So it sounds like that was just a bunch of acquisition on the go.
Yeah, I mean, each one of the GMs that ran a segment had their own set of acquisition strategies and targets, and that included also, packaging and divestiture of assets and so on and so forth. When the company I was with was acquired in 2014, before I arrived, the company had about 30,000 people. When I joined the firm, they had just gone through a really big divestiture of their call center business, and they had moved from about 30,000 people to about 12,000 people. I think that when we saw that process and that journey, being part of it, it was a machine that was working, and some of those aspects of the machine would, chew up smaller companies and spit them out, and the acquisition wouldn't really realize its value. So you'd be in a scenario where, there was a compelling business case for why they acquired it, but the way in which they integrated the business caused a lot of people to leave. And when people leave, that is kind of key to how they succeed, and how you actually get the value. So that's something that I was always kind of concerned with in my own role as part of the School Messenger organization. What I didn't want to do is be in a scenario in which, people were like, hey, I can't work here. I don't want to work here. I wanted to always kind of I was kind of protected them because they were an exemplar for what you could accomplish as a cloud native organization in a larger enterprise that might not have had that as their obvious primary pattern. So I would say that, in our journey between 2015 and 2022, they went from cloud last to multi-cloud, very facile with that. They had an integrated multi-cloud strategy that included on-prem data centers as well as also in the cloud. And then they ended up doing very much, I would argue, in some cases, pretty leading and bleeding edge work, whether it be around machine learning, artificial intelligence, using native backing services for things like natural language, processing and engagement around some of their call center tools and so on and so forth. And I've seen work that we started years ago really kind of catch fire and do really interesting things up to today. And then we also did some really interesting things around moving hardware solutions to software-based solutions. For example, where you had, like media mixing for virtual network operator, and then doing all that in the cloud in software. And that was something that was big part of cost savings. So you didn't have to renew a fleet of a data center, all the physical hardware, managing all the complexity around that fleet, and essentially its compliance regimen as well. So that was something that really kind of fit into, when people talk about cloud native or multi-cloud or any of these things, what really comes down is what's the threat surface that you're going to be managing, and how are you going to ensure that you're not introducing new risk to the organization. So,
yep. I'd love to kind of touch on, you talked a little bit about after an acquisition, if people leave, like you kind of lose the really core part of what made that company, right? That culture. What are your thoughts around, how do you retain that culture in that organization? How do you ensure kind of a good meshing of the acquiree and the acquirer in terms of culture, so that people feel aligned that, hey, we're part of this new company with this maybe new vision or new direction? How do you ensure that there's a good mesh there culturally?
So, as a change and transformation first kind of leader, I kind of view there's two schools of thought when it comes to acquisitions. One is buy it and leave it alone and hope that they integrate and assimilate slowly, or buy it and when the acquisition is completed, you go right in and you make the changes immediately. I am in the former category. I prefer to be able to be like, look, we've made a change, we figured this out, and we will, as a team, come together to figure out how that integration will be done. But it will not be a let it sit and ultimately integrate over a long period of time. That longer period of time and that kind of let it alone and don't make any changes, what I find is that it creates a culture of us versus them. There is a notion that you had people that were part of the organization before, and they're like, hey, you know what, everything that doesn't work about, it's kind of like the two best companies that you could work for is your last one and your next one. But if you're in an integration, you just get to hate the one that you're in. And if you can get that out of the kind of fabric of how those discussions are happening, and you really kind of move it like, you see people from the acquired team take leadership positions in the core team. You see people in the core team move into the acquisition. You don't starve them for their headcount or their service contracts. You're really able to take what made them special in an acquisition and ultimately integrate it. Not every dimension of an acquisition is around, great technology. Sometimes it's a customer buy. And being very honest and direct with people about what was the investment thesis and what the strategy is, I think is important, because everybody that we work with are not only adults, but they're professionals as well. So if you treat them like that, then they're going to be clear-eyed in the decisions that they make and how they participate in the team. And I think that what I find is that if somebody was to kind of be mealy in how they addressed something that I was working on, I would kind of see it. You could feel it when somebody's not being like direct with you. So I always kind of went with the big picture. Here's what the investment thesis is for Apollo, our private equity firm. Here's the implementation of that at our business level, our enterprise level. Here's what it means for you in this segment. And then when I was in Notified, it was really like you have a book of business where you're running a business independent of the larger enterprise, but you still report up into this structure. So it's kind of a multi-level structure where there's targets for every business, there's targets for every product, and ensuring that the people that are working on those products understand that context is, I think, a very important aspect of how you deliver value.
Yeah, absolutely. You need people aligned, right? To it's kind of like, this is the mission that they have, and this is how this fits into this larger mission overall.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Something you kind of touched on was, and I love this expression, a cloud last company, right? I think a lot of the time people talk about cloud native and cloud first or born in the cloud. Cloud last is, I kind of like that term, right? For typical, kind of legacy, or as a replacement for the word legacy. Have you ever taken a process from an acquiring company and kind of had it up level through to the acquirer, to the parent company? It sounds like some of the kind of technical expertise or cloud firstedness of some of these acquired companies was able to kind of permeate. Is that true, or how do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, I think that the biggest one that I saw was when I was the chief architect of the organization, one of the big areas, especially in West, was that because they grew through acquisition and they were a telco, you saw proliferation of monitoring technologies that were out there. And what we were able to do was, instead of coming down with a iron fist and saying, hey, thou shalt have one monitoring tool, we were like, okay, we're going to go from 100 to 6. And the 6 that we're going to have, we're going to get really good with. So one of the challenges I see with a lot of, providers out there, especially when they get integrated into a large business, is that people get mediocre at lots of things as opposed to really good with a few things. And so what we did is we made a significant investment in around things like application performance monitoring, network monitoring, kind of distributed kind of external systems and monitoring of our estate. And then we overlaid that onto our business systems. We had a couple of different telco monitoring technologies that were in there as well. And think of your favorites, Thousand Eyes, Dynatrace. We were really key in New Relic. AppD was in there for a while. But then we had all of the other kind of long tail around.
Long tail, yeah.
Around legacy monitoring technologies. And what we did was we said, okay, we lopped them off and we kind of made sure that the teams that we had were really good at what they did. And when they were really capable with those tools, what we saw was that acquired, and they originated out of an acquisition, we saw it move up in and throughout the entire enterprise. And what we did was we said, okay, we're going to make a baseline that if somebody's running a technology, it has to be monitored. If it's running any kind of system. So at one point we had it to the point where when a Kubernetes container was actually instantiated, all the automation and APM was actually baked into that right at the outset for just basic performance monitoring of the container. And then from there they can then stub it out to be able to do more business context or business appropriate context monitoring as well.
Nice. So I love the story there around that technical consolidation, right? Because we have customers at Ops level that go through a similar challenge. They've grown through acquisition and they find this on 2 dimensions. One is on the monitoring tool side, like, hey, we have I loved your example, 100 different monitoring tools, but they also have different internally built pieces of software that through acquisition are doing the same thing. Like we have 6 different image scaling services or a bunch of different payment platforms. And it's like, how do we consolidate that as well? So how do you kind of think about, how do you drive that forward? How did you drive that forward? Like what kind of tools or process did you put in place to take that 100 and get it down to 6?
Well, so I had an opportunity to work with a team of architects that really focused on business architecture. And business architecture would look at kind of the domains that drove the organization, how that value would be delivered. And then what we would look at would be whether or not the technology was best in class, whether or not the technology had an active roadmap, whether or not we had good financial terms with it. We were a large enough organization that we could typically negotiate favorable terms for most things. And then what we would do is we would look at, could we also articulate a playbook for a day zero condition and how a team would mature inside that, whatever that technology was. Like, we weren't really a B2C company, so we didn't really deal with like payments and that, right? But in the case of, say, for example, like an SMS gateway, there was one point we had 7 or 8 of them, and it was like, well, can we get down to 2? The answer wasn't necessarily always get down to 1. I mean, people always think that when you're doing consolidation, it's a consolidation down to, one technology to rule them all. And it's really never that. It's really like, how do we get the choices where you get the most capability with the least amount of mental burn from a mental model shift for any engineer? So what you wanted to do is be able to go and say, I wanted to have, we built a notion of what we call a cloud native enablement team. And instead of necessarily having that just be, leaders and directors and so on, we had line level engineers who were capable of having conversations with their peers about what worked and what didn't work. We had a set of architectural decisions that we had implemented, and we also evangelized. And in that evangelization, what we also did was we said, it's never stopping. It's a living it's a living technology strategy. It's a living architecture portfolio. And in doing so, what we were able to do is give people the easy way would be the right way. So like if you were going to go and say, hey, I'm going to build my solution on some exotic technology and we're going to be the only people that know it, I'd be like, fine, that's cool. That's great. But you got to be this tall to be on the ride, meaning that you have to have all this baseline kind of path to production. You have to be able to audit it. You have to be involved with our compliance regimen and so on and so forth. And what we found was like, if you go and you table set that mise en place of like, here's your technology portfolio, here's the things that you don't have to worry about. And if you use them the way we want you to, your day is going to be way, way smoother. And the thing is that you can be exotic and that's fine. But the thing is that in doing so, you also have an accountability to the enterprise to perform and deliver. So we're not getting the organization in harm's way. I reported to a CIO who was very progressive in his view of technology, but what he didn't want was surprises and he didn't want unnecessary risk. So we would have conversations about people would be like, I'm going to do this huge effort to save this bit of money. And when he would turn around and be like, why? Why would we introduce that kind of risk to the organization when it would be like, just write the check and we continue to do this. And then we operate and transform around that as opposed to just, create unnecessary anxiety for the organization. And that would never, our CISO and our CIO and I were, like a three-legged stool when it came to that. Because the thing is that if I introduced risk unnecessarily because I prioritized a transformation that was going to be valuable but not outweighing its risk profile, I would
not worth it.
It wouldn't be worth it. It wouldn't be a good. Yeah. Wouldn't be a good use of the company's resources or the political capital it would take to transform that organization.
Yeah. Something I was thinking about is the analogy you gave around, like, you have to be this high. It sounds a lot like from platform engineering, the city of the golden path. Like, here's this golden path. If you use these tools, you're going to have a good time. And, if you want to do your own thing, like, you can build your own path, but we want to make sure you don't get lost into the woods. We want to make sure that you're still upholding that sort of baseline set of considerations around security, performance, reliability. I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more as to like what went into the baseline at West, right? For all these different companies that you were, all these different segments and verticals and GMs that you were overseeing and trying to implement this technology for. What was considered important to be able to achieve and show that baseline?
So there's 2 dimensions of it. There's the process dimension, which I'll go and say we basically went with Agile and we moved to SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework. The chief of staff for the CIO and I was like, look, that's table stakes. That's not going to be the area of controversy. So we were able to implement a process where a lot of the work that was done on the side of the desk was no longer being done. So that was dealing with like, what's the process and discipline around, programmatic delivery of solutions. Really important that that's done and dusted. we moved from a technology standpoint, specifically around the golden path to production. We dealt with traditional web apps and we dealt with streaming apps. And the traditional web apps and the traditional streaming apps, the only way we could get consistency across those was we went with where are we storing our source code. So we were a Git hub enterprise customer. We would use, I believe, a lot of the Atlassian tools, Fisheye, Crucible, Artifactory. So a lot of the stuff that you saw from HashiCorp. And then from there, we had web apps that ran on our platform, which was an abstraction using Pivotal Cloud Foundry. Now VMware Tanzu application service, or I don't even know what it's called today. But anyway, that was one of the abstractions. So there were teams that were in the platform that were dealing with the abstraction, and they were dealing with a multi-cloud strategy that way. And then from there, you had the teams that were not in that, and they would go through, the Terraforms, depending on whether or not they were on, depending on what IaaS they were on, and then they would move into their monitoring components as well. So you saw the life cycle, that golden path to production: source control, binaries and artifacts, auditability, configuration and deployment, and then ultimately monitoring at the end. We made sure that was table stakes for all of the applications in the portfolio. And then when we would acquire a new company, we would be like, hey, what are you using for these solutions in these spaces? And it was never you got to rip and replace your solution. So for example, like Circle CI was introduced through an acquisition as opposed to through one of our own decisions. But the thing is, it was like, what's working about this? How can we use it? Is this good? Is this a modern practice that will delight developers as they come into the organization? Because the last thing I wanted to do is hire a brand new engineer, bring him into the organization and be like, here's your cinder block, and go for running that sprint right there. It was like, how do you eliminate friction in high performing teams? Because nobody wants to see a big bureaucratic morass around customer change requests and all this other stuff. We were really able to go and say, if you are in the system and you're using it the way we've agreed upon, you can eliminate the change request cycle of the large enterprise because you're operating inside the system, and we can eliminate or isolate the blast radius around certain decisions, so you would not be in an area where you were introducing undue risk. So if we think about kind of like from the security dimension, network, application, and colleague are the three dimensions of most threat surfaces. We were really dealing with the network and the application tiers right out of the gate. So there was no doubt about it. Everything else was just like, good training practices and hoping that some executive isn't clicking on a link in their email, that kind of thing. So,
Right. So I love the focus on it. Really is looking at the different parts of the SDLC and then understanding like these are the kind of suites of tools that are important, and there is the possibility for new tools to come in if they kind of make sense and bring developer delight.
Oh, without a doubt. That is exactly what it is. So, I mean, like if we think about our journey started, I think, as ops level was getting underway. And if you think about kind of the technologies that you've implemented, we had to cobble those together using like Confluence and the Atlassian suite and kind of going through the old school way of doing it, where I would love to have been able to, like, we had to go through a SOC 2 Type 2 audit, and that process was a process. I mean, there was effort involved there. I would have loved to have been able to just go and say, we're going to open up the console, we're going to let you look at it, and then you're going to give us the thumbs up. That would have been a great way of doing it. So
we were also at ops level SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, and I fully empathize with the expression. It's a process. And we also use ops level internally to help our own, for certain controls that we have in our SOC 2 compliance. It's great. So I wanted to kind of touch on this idea of developer delight and developer experience. Like, how do you think about developer experience tying in with high functioning teams? Like, your goal as an engineering leader is to help implement, high functioning teams in your organization. What role does kind of developer experience play in that?
Well, I think that engineering teams are the highest cost line of most enterprises. So when I think about, if you compare a salesperson or an operations person or any of those other roles that are inside an organization, and if you're going to have a high dollar FTE or even a contractor or agency contractor in the organization, anything that introduces friction in their role or their desire to be at the organization is something that I want to eliminate, whether that be through onboarding, whether that be through, like, I look a lot at the DORA metrics for how fast does an engineer go from day zero to committing code. And typically we were able to get that between 2 and 3 weeks, between the day they arrived at the organization, laptop in hand, getting them through and being able to deliver code into production. And that was something that I found was a great benchmark for the organization. I bought the book Accelerate for every one of my leaders, and I had them buy it for every one of their leaders, and then, kind of espouse the Nicole Forsgren kind of way of working, and that was something that I felt was really important because that gave us a external metric for us to be able to look at whether or not developers were being delighted or not. And if they weren't, we would always be willing to ask, what works and what doesn't work. I think that what we saw was that, and this is the reality about transformation journeys, is that to get to day zero doesn't mean that you're always going to be, improving. Sometimes you go and you get to day zero or day N, and then you devolve a little bit because some leader or somebody that was what I'll call a Nexus employee has moved on from the organization, and maybe the team wasn't as invested as that person was in this one dimension of what they're doing. So how do you be able to kind of have an evergreen or ever flowing fountain of kind of professional development so the teams get there? And what I think is that when I think about delighting a team is that if they could see their career growing inside your organization, either through tools, technologies, learnings, or interesting projects going to production, you're able to have, a high functioning and motivated team. What we found was that anytime we introduced a new thing, like for example, like if we introduced an ops level in our organization, we would need to have a playbook for it. We would need to have people that evangelized it. It would be rolled out in that manner. And the thing is it wouldn't be a sales engineer from your organization that would be doing that. It would be a person in my team that was going out and, showing the value and, going through a, kind of a case study of our internal work where, when some team member has a question, they have a person to call. And they could actually, and whether it's an easy technology or a difficult technology to implement. I mean, some of them are not as straightforward as ops level. So,
Yeah. We in some of our customers have that same kind of notion, right? There's our internal champion, and they go through and they kind of do that roadshow, and they're a good point person in the company to help answer questions as well. We talked a lot about kind of at the team level, having a team being high performing. As I think about across the organization, what are some ideas you have around how to keep different teams kind of aligned to a common goal or a common purpose?
So I think about, you've got product management, product development, and then you've got software development. And I think that if you think about a process that is able to kind of, chain across those, whether that be XP in the face of product and software development, you've got scaled agile in the intersection between product management and product development and some touch to software engineering. You have different methodologies that you could use for those, but I think it really is that whatever process you picked, get really good at it and commit to it. Because the thing is like whether you're using Shape Up or Safe or Lean or, MVP or, Lean Enterprise or, whatever it is that you're focused on, what I think is that it needs to be communicated across the organization on how you're going to report. I think that one of the things that's most important that a lot of organizations really miss is that finance, it could be your greatest ally or your greatest anchor. And if they are informed about what is happening and what the value of what you're doing is, that is something that I think is a really important thing. And those business metrics, if your process can have that as a natural exhaust of just executing the process, I think that's a really important aspect. And that makes product managers accountable to, their product owners, who in turn are working with their software engineering leaders and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. And I think that, one of the things that I've always kind of believed is that if you push the decision making as low down the organization as you possibly can, so decisions are being made locally, then they're owned locally, and then you build out the process to be able to, aggregate those up without necessarily having it become presentation theater. So I think about like we used, the scaled agile framework, and then we used the tools that Atlassian had built for, kind of aggregating that up in that development model. But the biggest thing is I never wanted somebody to be able like, I got to now take this screen out and I have to put it in a PowerPoint. If they did that activity, then we failed. That's a failure.
Right.
So,
And the goal is that data is there and that, people can kind of pull and self-select for it. And, the reporting is kind of there because it's an output of the process. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. We have a similar thing here. And I think it's, I can't think of any high performing team I've seen where they didn't have that kind of decision making at the edge, right? Anything where you have that centralization, inevitably that becomes a bottleneck.
Yeah. I mean, I did, about 10 years in the military, and the orientation around mission control versus command and control. Command and control organizations always will lock up and stop because there's everything bottlenecks up. If you could push the mission down to as low in the organization as possible, people are able to make decisions knowing that they're not going to run afoul. And if they're making a decision, I kind of look at it like this: action is always better than inaction. If you're making a decision and you're moving things forward, you could learn from that. But if you're just sitting there and you're like, hey, I hope somebody tells me what to do next, guess what? You're probably not the best person for our organization, because what we did was, in that leverage buyout lifecycle around transformation, I think that's really important to note this, is that there were people that wanted to be unleashed for their full capability, and a transformation agenda really gives them a remit to do that. So we saw people that were line level engineers grow to be really influential folks in our organization, because what all of a sudden, when the frozen middle above them is removed, all of a sudden they're like, oh wow, this is real. I could do this here, And there's a thought leader named Adrian Cockcroft out there, and he always said that when he was at Netflix, he hired all of his best engineers from people that he's like, where do you think I got them? I got them from you. You just weren't using them to their full potential. And he kind of let them achieve their full. I always resonated with that as a story, because people, if they're here and if they're capable, why would we do anything that inhibits that capability? That creativity.
I want to ask you kind of an almost famous type of question, right? When I think about that decision making at the edge, there's this tension that kind of bubbles up around product work and engineering work, right? The engineers are saying, well, we need to scale, we have this tech debt we need to address, our on-call pain is really high. And product is saying, yeah, we also have these features we have to ship. What are some thoughts or tools that you thought about to be able to help resolve that tension?
So I consider tech debt part of the backlog, and it needs to be managed on the balance sheet. I mean, it's just that simple. If you are going to make a decision that says, hey, I'm never going to prioritize, technical debt. I'm always going to be feature. And then when things all of a sudden grind, the extensibility just kind of goes to zero. You could tell that story. I could tell you that story at the outset, because the thing is that it's that notion of, you could allocate a certain percentage of every sprint or release cycle to technical debt reduction, but that doesn't actually address the root cause of good practices at the outset. And if it's an ongoing decision where the product leader knows that they're improving the product on an ongoing basis, there was a scenario, and it doesn't matter when it was in my career, where we had to overhaul a system from a security perspective. And what happened was that was years of decisions had kind of, aggregated and like almost the geology of bad decisions over and over. And all of a sudden now it was, you got to the point where it was like, okay, we're at a critical mass point. Well, now you get no features. But if we change the behavior around how technical debt was being managed, you're able to ultimately see that through that whole cycle. And then the engineering teams don't sit there and be like, hey man, that platform, it might not be burning now, but I could see the oil firing
it's
off.
smoldering. Yeah.
And the thing is that nobody, I don't believe in hero work. I don't want people to be on call. I don't want people to have to, as a norm, work outside of working hours to be able to, take care of something that could have been taken care of at the outset. It's like there's no party like a release party. Well, there's also nothing like an incident where you're like, right, this could have been corrected at the outset. So I think that what we found is that product managers that have been burned by this are a lot more amenable to this outcome. I think sales forces and revenue officers and things like that, they're always like, I want more features.
Now, this quarter we need this thing, this customer,
sell. But the thing is that if you kind of look at it and go and say, hey, look, if what we do is not stable, you don't have a customer. If it's not scalable, you don't have a new customer. If it's not secure, you have no customers. It's that simple. Okay. And they're focused on speed and time to market. But the thing is that if we're able to kind of all upskill the technical sophistication of the organization so people understand the difference between a feature and, that ultimately the risk associated with it, I think it comes down to a risk discussion. And I think that, there's an ongoing care and hygiene that has to occur inside a portfolio. And I think that you can't have 100% of your engineering effort focused only on feature development. It just will not. It's not a sustainable way, because I can tell you what will happen is you'll end up having to do a full rewrite of your platform, and you'll probably be a candidate for a leverage buyout, a transformation or a change agenda that is not being decided internally. And ultimately your marquee project will be in that Clayton Christensen crossing the chasm. You've got a revenue line that inhibits you from being able to make good decisions about the next generation of your product. That crossing the chasm will only happen when you abandon the cash cow of your business. So I think that if you think about it from this perspective, I don't even look at this as a technology problem. I look at this as a business problem. And if you think about it as a business problem and you articulate it as a business problem, nobody's going to be like, oh, those tech folks over there need to do some of that work they should have done all the other time. Because people forget when they go and say, I need feature. It's just like you have business successes and technology failures. As long as that's not happening and you're able to go and say, look, this is our business. This needs to be accounted for as a product leader on the balance sheet for what we're going to prioritize. This is not a me problem or a you problem. It's a we problem.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing I think is important. So
a quote I heard a long time ago is that engineering work is product work, right? And it goes back to that, like we're not doing this just because of whatever, right? Because it's more elegant, or no, it's because it's going to help us scale, or it's going to be more secure, or it's going to help our systems be better.
Think about your SOC 2 Type 2. That allows you to sell into large enterprises. If you don't have the discipline that gives you the ability to get that certification, then you don't get to play at the large enterprise space. You want to sell into the Fortune 2000, you need to have that discipline. And what we found was that product leaders, when they are accountable for their P&L, go and say, oh, that compliance regimen unlocks those customers. Now that's a business problem. That's not a technology problem. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about how, engineering problems are business problems. That's all they are.
Yep. I love that. Well, listen, Thomas, before we wrap up, I always like to ask guests, what is your favorite music to kind of work to or have focus with?
I'm a music nut, but I think that when I want to write or do anything like that, I like to look at, I'm a Spotify customer, so I use, I'll do like a station based on like either Grammatic or Hermanos Gutierrez, and just let it kind of be low in the background so I can hear it, but not so high that I'm going to get distracted by it. But those are the things that I like. So, but I mean, it's always on. There's always something playing. So, except for it. So, but thank you, Ken. I appreciate the opportunity to do this with you.
Yeah, likewise. And what's the best way for people to follow your work on social media?
I'm only on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So feel free to follow me at Thomas Squeo at LinkedIn. And then,
cool.
Well, not hard to find. So.
Perfect. We'll be including your LinkedIn info in the show description as well. Thomas, again, it has been just great having you. I super appreciate your, just taking the time to talk to us. And I found myself like vigorously head nodding with a lot of what you were saying. I think you and I share a lot of kind of common beliefs on high functioning teams and engineering execution. So to all of our listeners, I want to thank everybody again to making it to the end of our episode, and thank you to everyone for listening. If you as a listener have any topics or guests you'd like to see on the show, please send us an email at levelup@opslevel.com, and we'll see everybody next time. Happy building.
Thank you.